I have the very difficult task to moderate, chair, whatever you call it, this ultimate roundtable of the conference, which has been extremely rich and fruitful, hopefully. And after morning presentations, which I think have been quite an interesting point d'orgue, I would say, sort of a final bunch of questions, which I would like perhaps to summarize, and in order to orientate what I would like to this roundtable to be with all this audience. The papers we heard this morning, and in this they echoed a number of other concerns of the same type that we heard in the days before, shared three things, I think. Very documented, pertinent, knowing analysis of the current post-critical conditions, how we got there, its mechanisms, its reasons, its ways of functioning. Secondly, I think a very strong claim that we should find a way as architects, but not only, maybe almost as citizens, to renew with a critical project for society through architecture somehow and its related activities. And thirdly, the belief or the hope or the wish that architecture can sustain this claim, and that it can be perhaps a platform because of its very nature, which is essentially hybrid, complex, which stands at the crossroads of a number of human activities, which obviously I don't have to name, that it could be a platform or a way from which to regain or to reformulate, perhaps, things such as the collective, the political, debate, which is an essential vector, perhaps, of this reclaiming, all things that have been dramatically swallowed and obliterated, perhaps, by the neoliberal turn of the 80s, of which we are heirs. So I perhaps would like this discussion to engage with the next step of this survey. How can we do that? What can be the tools, the means able for us as architects, and again, not in a strictly maybe disciplinary terms, but as a profession or maybe a mindset, as Le Corbusier would have said. Sorry to cite this controversial, still controversial architect here, but a mindset, architecture as a mindset, perhaps also can help or contribute or even generate new ways of reclaiming these different vanishing qualities of civic life. And I think the consequence of this very broad question, of course, is that perhaps here, and that's what I would like you to propose you as questions, it questions all we do as architects, namely the academia. How do we teach? How we are taught? We've heard in several presentations, for instance, the regret that housing is not taught anymore as in many schools as a valid subject. Housing as the substance, essential substance of cities, where the main place for everyday life. Well, why isn't not taught in most schools anymore? Why is only museums and extraordinary projects the main food for design studios? How do we teach? Do we still teach within the closed walls of academia, where a lot of discourse on critical discourse on post-critical emerges? Do we keep all that confined into the walls of schools, which are an essential place, of course, for elaborating in a sort of serene, perhaps, or state of mind a number of concepts? But how do we engage with a society which often sees architects as ugliness makers and agents of the dictature they are supporting, have to bear every day? Well, in other words, I think, yes, these series of wishes in question the way academia, architectural academia works. Second, it questions also how we practice strongly. How do we embody these wishes, these claims into architectural practice? Does it mean we have to refuse certain programs? Or does it mean that we have to never relinquish to the current fashion of flexibility, for instance, which is can be criticized as one of the ploys of an ever-changing capitalism to constantly rearrange its spaces regardless of any marks that are sort of constant, or I think it's an essential debate which relates this question of the critique of late capitalism and concretely the spatial formulation of architecture. Preservation, I mean, it's understood as some kind of old thing, but at the same time maintaining a number of neighborhoods, buildings, and articulating a critical attitude towards their use for gentrification could be also a way. In other words, I just want to throw a number of ideas which I hope will bounce back through you to start thinking about these questions in a perhaps more operative way. And thirdly, and last but not least, I'd say how do we use these, how do we mobilize these wishes for the collective, the political, and the debate into our criticism, the way we criticize? How do we write? Which tools do we have? Do we generate provocative images? Do we study extremely thoroughly and understand through the history of ideas, I mean, within a more academic framework, the game of trends and produce new knowledge and understanding about that? Do we try to reach out there the public and write criticism which try to conquer, I mean, daily journals and talk about architecture? What does it say, all these state of things, about the current state of architectural journals, which, as we know, are caught between what's left of the historical journals, such as L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui, which has become a sort of image journal funded by the Emir of Qatar, right? And on the other hand, the more intellectual academic journals where ideas are constructed but which fail sometimes to reach the society we want to engage with. So I hope this roundtable will be an opportunity to test in situ our claim for the collective, the political, and the debate, and perhaps to launch the discussion. I would like to turn to José, who has presented first this morning, and perhaps ask him to react on these questions, both about criticism and perhaps academia, because and perhaps develop a little bit the tools you can imagine to implement your constructivist criticism that you were advocating this morning. That's a difficult question. Further, my question a little bit. It was interesting in your presentation that the three intellectuals you cited as landmarks for you to renew the discourse on architectural criticism were not architects. There were three intellectuals that come from social sciences mainly, political sciences. So how would you see this articulation, and which vectors would you see for it to flourish in a way?
No, well, I mean, to answer that very simply, I mean, I think, and this, I mean, it's kind of reductive in a sense, but there seems to be more or less a tendency, the fact that when students are designing, they are very much sort of limited to the sphere of design itself. So let's say the design of buildings, and that's not necessarily criticism in itself, I don't think. And in that sense, I think, for example, School of Madrid is a very good example with incredible quality in terms of actual design. That's on the one hand. We could also cite other examples around the world. And then on the other hand, we have incredible work also being done at the discursive level. So basically, something closer perhaps to what we've been doing today. That is, say, trying to figure out how what criticality is in architecture as basically the domain of possibility within which a particular critical act can take place at all. Perhaps what is not so common is something to, I think, ask within academia, is for those two concerns for them to come together within a particular design act, without necessarily compromising, on the one hand, design quality, so to speak, or on the other, discursive quality. And of course, that's easier said than done, right? I mean, that's extremely difficult. But I don't think it's enough, and in that sense, I might disagree a little bit with Chris, to just acknowledge the fact that just by virtue of the fact that architecture produced today is embedded within certain sets of political and cultural forces, that fact alone renders that particular piece of architecture critical, or let's say for it to have a certain critical import. Because I mean, at least in my argument, and that's why I sort of invoked these guys, there needs to be a certain, actually a deep distortion at some level going on. So it's basically a double razor edge, meaning being embedded in the forces and then at the same time reconfiguring them in some way. So I think one needs to be, in that sense, careful and not say just we acknowledge the fact that we are aware of what's going on and then architecture is produced that way and we just follow along, but to actually try to enact some kind of subversive attitude through design. Now, I think the further questions say, well, what's the target of that hypothetical subversive action? Is it architectural design itself? So, for example, a building that just tries to kind of question the idea of typology, or question the idea of a column, or question the idea of architectural meaning, and so forth? Or does it try to, as I was trying to say, to induce knowledge that's actually relevant for other domains, like the political domain or the sociocultural domain, and so on and so forth? Is it that the first attitude is kind of a falling short, and is what we've been doing mostly? Or is it that the latter is too ambitious and it's actually a kind of a dream in a way? And actually, I mean, as I speak, I realize that if you take Hollansier, for example, he would probably argue that neither is possible in a way, because the minute we try to set up this plane of criticism and sort of rebel against it in some way, or kind of enact this subversive attitude, we are already feeding further the very plane of criticism that we're trying to go against. So yeah, it's a complicated situation. I think his own solution, the same way as I think Latours and Sloterdijk and Zizek, I think to a lesser extent, is to actually forget about the problem, and to say, no, let's not tackle the issue. I mean, let's not sort of remain within that dialectic, but let's actually sidestep the problem, and let's just go in a different track in a way. And that's why I think they come up with this kind of constructionist attitude, which is about putting things together in some novel way that ignores the biggest problem. Anyway, I spoke too much, probably. I mean, you have some reaction.
Well, I guess we'll have to agree to disagree. But to a certain extent, I guess at the heart of what I'm trying to argue for is, and perhaps another way of phrasing it is that you're talking about critical with a capital C. Whereas what I'm trying to kind of introduce is to move past that argument. I think we've been kind of getting caught up for the last kind of 10, 15 years on debates of is it critical, is it not? Whereas I guess I'm more interested in saying that the potential is that the value of the critic is as a kind of a forensic investigator to actually identify the benefits of a project or its detriments. It doesn't necessarily have to be overtly critical, as in the architect himself, the designer doesn't have to have actually deliberately set out to say something political in the work for it to be inherently political. And so that's what I'm kind of trying to argue for. So I agree that there's a nuance, perhaps, you know, in terms of how you deploy particular philosophical battlefield commanders in order to mount your argument for you. But I guess to come back to your earlier question, I mean, I still very much and I apologise because I don't speak Spanish, so some of the conversations we're having, you guys may have been actually having over the last couple of days, so please bear with me if I'm telling you to suck eggs. I subscribe to Jane Jacobs. You know, I think her broader, still resonant philosophy about critics, being local critics, being invested in a specific place, that can speak to the values of a particular kind of time, and even Alexandra Lang, you know, who's kind of, I guess, a recent metacritic to a certain extent in New York, who has been also trying to rail against the global critic, who just kind of jet sets in, brings in a kind of a globalised international value system about what makes good criticism and good architecture. I think those two things are kind of a really good example of the difference between a local embodied critic and a neoliberal critic. And we have to move beyond that neoliberal critic if we're going to really engender some trust in the public. And I guess that kind of gets to my point, really, which is that we have to increase the public's value of that criticism. And I think they're the ones that we've lost along the way. You know, we're so, even this conversation to a certain extent is a bunch of privileged people talking through very privileged lenses about kind of metacritique, you know, the critique of critique. Whereas the people that we really need to reach are those who our criticisms actually affect on a day-to-day basis. So the question about housing, I think, is a really, really vital one. And it's certainly something in Australia, there has been a number of conferences and books and symposiums over the last 10 years trying to understand this same kind of problematic, because all of the journals have gradually been subsumed by mainstream commercial media. They are all now just a kind of a voice for developers to espouse particular kinds of aestheticised kind of values. There is no assessment I don't like that kind of term, but there is no holding to account of architects against a set of broader principles. And at its core, it's because they're fundamentally worried about being sued. You know, the critic is no longer able to act in kind of a relative degree of autonomy as they once perhaps did. But that can only change if the public values what we have to say. And I think we've been obsessed for the last 15 years with these internal intellectual debates that we've lost our own relevance.
Well, that's a very important point, the legal point, because indeed, I think the lack of criticism in the sense of free speech about about what the environment that is made to us largely rests on economical and legal problems more than anything else, because there are many people ready to write and articulate all kinds of form of criticism, but it's extremely hard to find vectors and to have a lawyer behind each sentence. It's particularly developed in Australia, maybe less in continental Europe. But to go back to what you were saying, I think it's incredibly interesting that you've mentioned Jane Jacobs, because preparing all that and listening to what I could of the interventions, since I don't speak Spanish either, I'm sorry about that, I was struck by the fact that many issues that would be discussed and many examples that were studied come back from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Like if we were sort of now reenacting at the global scale issues and debates that had been already on the table in the wake of the critique of the triumph of functionalist modernism, to say things very quickly. The questions of going from the question of flexibility, the role of housing, the role of criticism, the relationship with the people, their understanding of where they live and how to infuse architecture with something which could bounce with their own cultural values, etc. I mean, all these questions are back on the table. And again, to go back to criticism and its vectors, At the time, there were journals were the privileged way of books and journal. And now, with the situation of journals, we find ourselves, I think, in this paradoxical situation that we are in this society of information, and yet criticism has less, it seems, ways to be heard and to be even formulated, therefore, than it had in this previous period. So what do you, again, think of this issue, again, of the means to convey criticism beyond academia? Anyone?
Yeah, well, maybe somebody else.
Well, maybe I can join in now, because, as you know, we were supposed to be separated groups, and
you are the
blended.
I'm sorry.
And in fact, as you speak, François, I was trying to formulate a very similar argument as yours, but driving it into a more local situation, because of course I know some of the people that have been speaking these days, and of course most of us are architects, which also have had some practical activities over these last few years. And of course, when you say how can we engage, I find a sort of paradoxical situation in terms of many architects becoming critical now, because everyone, in a way, in a format like this one, tries to be academic. And on the other hand, it's very difficult to position every argument that's been spoken here in the global situation of arguments in urban terms. For example, in my table, it was about the urban, and as you know, someone didn't come, and that's the reason we blended this together. So I would maybe ask the organizers of this event, what is their idea about the success of the event in terms of not you, but maybe in which ways they think they can engage this sort of very insular situation of speaking about post-critical and all that with a general, for example, urban debate.
I think maybe Sylvia can come to the table.
There are two questions in one, or the second I haven't got it. If you're just asking about our
how does this event in a way take place?
Also because this is maybe the last debate that's going to be taking place here.
Before a lecture.
Yes, well, I was not prepared for this, but I can tell you that when we first received so many wonderful work, I have to say, we were like amazed. We didn't expect to be receiving so many papers. And well, just going through all the process of revising and all this. And finally we find out that many of them like resonate in between them. And I thought that arranging them in tables was going to be hard work, but then I realized it was almost like very natural to gather them. Well, there have been some adjustments of agendas that have disturbed a little bit some of them, but in general, I think they have displayed this opportunity to talk about the things we are focusing quite relaxed in a quite relaxed way in this kind of format. From the first beginning, we thought that we didn't want just the people to be like speaking unidirectionally, and well. I don't know, I think that this format has been a success from my point of view, and also because most of you have told me so in this last days. And I don't know if
I don't know, perhaps I think that what I hear in the question is what do we do with this almost paradoxical situation that we are all gathered here on 3 days, in the kind of privileged circle that a university is and which it should be, for to construct ideas and discuss them, to discuss precisely a subject through which we would like to reclaim a kind of capacity to become critics again of society, and do it through our discipline, which is architecture, and therefore engage with out there. And how do we reconcile this seeming contradiction, and perhaps these questions, the outcome of such a gathering, our capacity to play here the debate we are wishing for, and then to convey it, and through which means into society at large. That's what I hear in
Yes, more or less, and also because the academic format in which we are right now, and this format of the papers and the presentations and the timing, produces some sort of flatness of the arguments. In fact, if you take this schedule, there was one called urban and another one post-critical. And I would also like to ask the more academical people here, like for example, Jose, in which ways your generation, for example, is going to try to break through this sort of flatness that the academic format produces, outside from university. Also because right here we have some people that have been working in some sort of activism, like I think, and which in a way is to produce, and maybe you are familiar with this in Spain. There's been a big drive towards architects getting involved in urban activism this last few years with probably very good results. So I would also like to ask you more academic help.
Well, I mean, I think there are two things I see in your question. One is about the arguments themselves, and then the other one is about how the arguments reach or not reach a wider audience. And those are two separate issues, I think. I kind of disagree deeply with the fact that because of the format of conferences, or even alternative format for conferences, which there are a few, it's not only like this one or like the other one, there are actually people doing a lot of work on how to question the conference format itself. You can find the most extremely radical arguments, actually. If at this particular conference's arguments came across as flat, that's basically the participants' fault, if you will, more than anything else.
Not the ones I saw.
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
I think too that the Madrid University in Spain, the school, which is a privileged platform where people prepare themselves to go out into the world, there still is a permeability among the professors and hopefully among the students of the trajectory between the world of activism, whether as an architect, whether working in the urban scene in a political way, and the university. And I think that where that connection is often lacking is in the academic world of the United States. And I think many of our sources for examining criticism and the role of the critic in the United States have been developed in that kind of pressure cooker atmosphere of the isolation of the American university from the political reality that surrounds it, and the kind of inward-looking academicism. And I think maybe if we were able to, from here, from Spain, develop and based on the true apportations that those studies have given us, be able to advance into a more connected or connected work with the rest of society, which is the nature of architecture in Spain, then we could move forward in that direction.
So something which would not be the dilemma of being either an academic or an activist, but
there is a
finding
certain
other ways to be an
permeability
architect.
in Spain. There still is. There still is a permeability between the academy and the profession, or the academy and my role as a writer in the general press. There still exists that connection, and I think through that there's a way of communication back and forth that has a lot of potential. And I find that more lacking in the United States.
Maybe Jose, you can finish your second half of argument and tell us what...
I was going to say something along those lines, actually.
Yeah.
I was going to say just that pretty much. But also that the counter-argument is that to reach a certain, degree of specificity or depth in terms of whatever research you are undertaking, whatever the field is. Well, I mean, it's basically the classical distinction between the pure sciences and the applied sciences. Yeah, you need a certain amount of pre-work that needs to happen. Yeah, so obviously American universities excel at that, and they produce incredible work. Of course, then the question arises: well,
Get that out of the university.
how do you get it out? But can you have both in the same academic environment? I mean, I guess that's the question. Or is it that depending on the region or the country, you get more of one kind and less of the other, and then you go somewhere else? It's the other way around.
I was very surprised, for example, in the other presentation we had about activism. It stopped short of the actual acts of political intervention. And that kind of surprised me. You've got all the tools and all the dangers, but what happens when you go out there in the street? And I think there are people in Madrid who could tell us.
Well, since John has finally joined us, maybe you can respond to that, because your presentation is precisely.
Now, this was I mentioned this was my intent to kind of lay a conceptual groundwork, because that's one of the critiques of these new activists, is that they just plunge directly into practice in a post-critical kind of mindset. They aren't grounded in these dispositions and understanding of they don't have a literacy for politics, and so this was kind of my intent, almost a personal intent with this research, is to kind of really quickly, I mean, because it can only skim over the surface of this kind of holistic, cross-disciplinary landscape, and
But how would you take all what you showed us into the field?
Well, the combination of these strong dispositions, which of course are subject to change. I think even Rancière's, it's always a danger to go deep into a philosophy like this, but I think it can be helpful to have some goalposts to move towards. I think it was Roberto Unger who said, a wind doesn't help he who doesn't know where to sail, or something like this. And then, of course, with the strategies I was going for, almost anything, like Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, anything could be a tool. I think even criticality in politics, you can see the rise of the right wing. These in themselves aren't ethical things, so they can be used to different purposes. So we have to talk about what kind of criticality, what are we critical of, who's critical of what, and what are their intentions, what are their ethical intentions. Well,
because your critique of the entry in which you chose was this embeddedness of artists into urban gentrification at the start of the urban projects, and their instrumentalization by the forces they would be more perhaps expected to combat or to be critical of. It was a really very convincing and elaborate critique. And then when it came to giving examples of an alternative to that, one wondered how it could be possible, considering that you gave this example of an artist planting a tree in front of a billboard in order not to cut the billboard, but to make the tree, through its growth, shade the billboard and completely obliterate the message. But what happens if the police comes and cut the tree? I mean, one wonders what is what's the word? The space. Well, for lack of another one, that is allowed for alternative practices to what you denounce. That what concretely one wonders. If you could give maybe examples, or
well, you have examples like park fiction in Berlin, and this depended on the local kind of the strength of the local community's political background and history of social movements, and so they were able to gradually appropriate this site that was targeted for this big neoliberal development. And park fiction, they pretended it was a park, and it became a park eventually. They tried this successfully on another site, but then sort of made this negotiation. But the problem is this danger in looking for a solution that can be applied, because each situation is unique. And I think, I looked at over-identification as an interesting way to get beyond irony and beyond this general critique.
And what can be the role of architects in all that? Or are these projects that you're referring to, which I don't know at all, a sort of fact of a sort of self-organization of left-wing forces within society, with perhaps architects on board or not? And how do we, again, this question of...
I think the first step is moving into more of a transdisciplinary mindset. So instead of the question, what is it for architects, and with this, but this has to, I think you need a synthesis of transdisciplinarity and disciplinarity. So, but the overall approach should be this holistic endeavor. I'm sorry. This. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. So yeah, it was mentioned in a presentation yesterday about architecture as the interface. So using architectural thinking, urbanistic thinking, I think has potential in, so instead of thinking we have to design a building, we have to design a building that's built, you can think of it as, like David Harvey's dialect of utopianism, designing a process, designing a utopia. It might not get built, but especially nowadays we have something that's called derivative architecture.
Right.
So many of these projects are just not even meant to be built. They're meant to get the investment. So we're already living in this ethereal type of world anyway. So architects, I think, have to recalibrate themselves to this, but also keeping one foot in the classic. You could realize a building or an intervention somewhere.
So bouncing on that, does it mean that in architecture schools we should really question design as a sort of compulsory goal and essential part of architectural teaching, just like it was done in some schools after May 68, for instance? In France, for instance, after May 68, some schools refused to design anymore. It was all about history, criticism, theory, interdisciplinarity, reading Foucault. I mean, that was really the times, and reducing design to and opening it up. You could have your diploma with a text, almost a novel if you wanted to write one. There were schools like that really questioned design to the point of refusing to teach it because it had been an agent of the capitalistic, in France, I mean, the grands ensembles, the modernization, top-down, state-driven, standardized functionalist, mainstream thing. And I think we saw a revival of that in the 90s, for instance, in Italy, with people like the Stalker Group, or people who claimed that I mean, to go out there in these areas that had been designed in spite of architects, or perhaps with architects, but who nobody knew, and which is 95% of the production that we architects more or less endorse or produce even. Not us, but I mean, some architects. And to render legible this landscape that had been produced by these contradictory forces of urban management was enough, and to map it was enough to take the place of design. So the 70s, the 90s, the 2010s, what could we, in the light of all these extremely knowledgeable assessments of the situations we're in, and of which we had many examples during these past 2 days, what would be the next step of this questioning of design? I mean, that's something I think is essential for our where we are now. So, do you have any teachers in this school, perhaps, have ideas about that? I saw yesterday wonderful models of pieces of chalk that have been sort of altered by
Maybe I can join now, and because the responsible for that pieces of chalk is Antonio.
No, I'm not.
No. But
So how do we?
because I wanted to ask something to Antonio and to Fernando. I spoke before because Fernando is doing an investigation that's directed by you, I understand, and also you are the responsible of this laboratory of ETSAM, chalk laboratory. So what I would like to ask either of you, but maybe Antonio can join in, is about the role of collectivity in academic investigations. Because, for example, I know that what Fernando has been doing belongs to a certain group of lines of investigation that you are directing here. You and many other people are working in this way in this school right now. What's your position about this idea of the collective investigation?
Well, I would prefer begin saying something about what I have received at this school, and I think, and many other schools in Spain, of course, during the last 20 years, under what Bernard Schumi wrote quite a number of years ago, saying that it has been impossible to be an architect without thinking about the critical dimension of our work. And I think that was not at this school during the last 20 years. Criticism was not as close to the focus of many of the researchers, and most of the school was concerned about practice without paying attention to the critical dimension of their work. And I think that in Spain, many of the education and many of the schools have been focused too much in practice, and the consciousness of criticism and the consciousness of the critical dimension of the architect's work, either working as an architect practitioner or working as in a critical work, it has been increasing recently, little by little, through the last 2 decades. And I think that this school now is quite visible, the presence of works in doctoral dissertations, even in research team groups on critical. There is quite a clear presence of criticism as a discipline close knit to the core of architecture practice, or not independent, as Maite Muñoz has been doing that work during many years at the school, defending the value of the necessity of the critical dimension of architectural criticism as a discipline who has to be addressed by architects.
Is there a critical forum for practice in Madrid? So I don't mean within the academic context, I mean beyond the walls of the hallowed academe.
I think there's the Club of Urban Debates. I think the College of Architects, which is the professional association, is an active, not only defending the business interests of architects, but also advocating for architecture in the public sphere. And I think it would be interesting, for example, I think it was kind of a disaster, but recently the College of Architects, for example, intervened in the controversy over the development of the Porta del Sol, sponsoring a competition together with the town hall, a competition of ideas to see what could be done with that plaza interface that's being turned into, there's an Apple store going up on one side and a huge block of former banking doors being turned into this hyper commercial center. They will review it all. So the architects here in Spain are a power. They're a voice that's listened to. And if they knew how to use it, there's also a national association of public architects that has its voice, and there's a cultural presence and exhibitions and so on. There's a lot that can be done. There's a lot of latent ways that architects can be heard and can use their influence in the public sphere, I think.
There was a question there.
I wanted to say that I think that following the lines of Antonio, that also following the lines of the idea that there's an advantage of making the critical discourse more local. I think not to lean towards the idea that Spain is different, which I'm not trying to touch on that. I think that the 80s and 90s in Spanish architecture can be described for something which is quite unusual, and turn architecture into kind of a discipline that didn't have the necessity to become critical, because there was an unnatural and unusual connection between the political discourse, the social discourse, and architecture. And the fact that democracy needed to reconstruct in terms of its image and its infrastructure the country, turn architecture into the image, into the mechanism, the instrument for that. And there was an amazing balance. There was a connection by which architecture did the job for the political discourse and for the social development in such a way that everybody was happy. And architecture found its place in an almost, let's say, natural but unnatural way. Because it's not, it's decision from a critical point of view. So it turned architecture, and the architecture school in particular, as Antonio is saying, into a non-critical school, because there was no need, because there was a balance. There was no need to face against the system, because the system and architecture were running together. There was, I think, to do with that period in the 40s and 50s in the United States, in which there was a connection between power, politics, production, companies, etc., and architecture. The funny thing is now that balance has been broken. And then, on the one hand, architecture doesn't know where to go in this country. This country is talking about housing in a very different way, completely independent from architecture. We're talking about the constitutional right for housing, not the form of housing. We're talking about the right for housing. That's what we listen in the street. That's the political discourse now. That's the social discourse. It's nothing to do with architecture, because it's pre-architecture. And doesn't need architecture as a critical device, because it's much more fundamental. It's about need and constitutional rights. So architects and our post-critical discourse really look rather ornamental. But in order to be post-critical, it's funny, because we should have been, there was a need to be critical before. It's difficult to be post-critical if you haven't been critical. So I think that's what Antonio is saying, is that we find ourselves rather behind in the post-critical thing because we missed the first step.
Perhaps, John, you would like to comment on that?
In invoking the ghost of Gramsci a couple days ago, I was suggesting that on the one hand there's a possibility of this kind of march through institutions, and it's possible that Spain in particular has a very strong institutional framework within which architects can act. But it's also possible, or historically it may be the case, that things have shifted here in certain ways, so that now a kind of extra institutional position has more effectiveness, possible efficacy. So in talking about activism, which isn't the same thing as activity, but activism as such, I think we should acknowledge that activism, and by that I do mean the extra-institutional kind of activity, politically oriented, that architecture has some history of activism which might be reclaimed. So I don't know if most people here noticed in 2008 when Obama was running for the presidency, he was being tarred with the brush of somebody named Saul Alinsky. Alinsky was a famous community organizer in Chicago, and Obama was being described as having, very pejoratively, negatively, as having come right out of that. Interestingly, Jane Jacobs also was very much an admirer of Alinsky and learned a lot from him. And she herself kind of cut her teeth in sort of mastering strategies or tactics of activism, of urban activism, by associating with various people in the 1950s in New York in kind of preparing for this grand David versus Goliath battle against Robert Moses. And by the 60s, she had kind of mastered certain techniques. She understood what it took to mobilize a neighborhood or a community. She understood what use things like investigative journalism or pamphleting and those kinds of techniques could have in a particular situation. And by the end of the 60s, she prevailed with respect to this power broker in New York. But Jane Jacobs was not the only one. I mean, there were other kinds of architectural activism that were being practiced, and I'm talking now about the US, but I'm sure some of you are well informed about the European situation. But thinking about the whole discourse of advocacy in the 60s, which even included people like Christopher Alexander, who, having come from, the elite world of computers and mathematics and so on, found himself in the barriadas in Latin America, trying to find a way to help people that were disempowered or couldn't speak for themselves speak, and using design and architectural knowledge, the expert knowledge that this field has for that purpose. So it wasn't a matter of the kind of refusal or big philosophy or non-design specifically. It was more another kind of tactics that architects too began to master back then. So, I mean, it's possible that some of that should be reclaimed. It's also possible that the kind of questioning of the institution or of the institutional framework within which any particular country or place engages to figure out what within that institutional structure is still malleable, is still open to a kind of transformation, and in what sense is it's absolutely frozen in place and therefore just has to be contested. In any case, I think it's possible to imagine a very careful, nuanced re-examination of both the tradition of activism on the one hand, institutions on the other, in order to see where we go from here. And that discourse could certainly take place within the academic context or outside it, either way.
Now, people like Denise Scott Brown also came from
absolutely.
there. Even later, projects such as the West Philadelphia Landscape Project with Anne Spurn.
So I think it has to be evaluated how successful those attempts were, and once we do that, we might sense how much juice they still have for our purposes today.
And today, I don't know if you're aware of the work of someone like Karin Smuts in Southern Africa. She works as an architect in the townships and has developed a sort of way of designing with and for people within a sort of, as you say, a sort of ambiguous, semi-counter-institutional kind of framework.
I think
There was
also
a question.
that with this, you say that we can talk like these 60s, an architect like Lina Bobardi. I think Lina Bobardi was a builder of institutions. So he created, as the says Pompeia, a new engagement between public administration, citizens to build new institutions. We can say also, well, the work of Aldo Manel with this plan of the urban voids in the 50s, that he transformed Amsterdam with more than 700 urban voids in this playground. But the question today is that we don't have institutions anymore, or our institutions are very, very in a crisis today. So taking this with the idea of the Madrid school practice, I think for architects now, we cannot say that you are practice or you are a theory, because these things are mixing a lot. We are creating the theory with the practice we are doing in the city of Madrid, and that's the point. For my personal case, theory comes when practice get much like engaged with the city. So very young architects in the School of Madrid are practicing many different things in the city that are changing the question of theory. So sometimes it's the practicing outside, but coming theory from this practice in the inside also, because many citizens are doing great things in the city, so they are discussing a lot what the urban things are, what the problems are, and how we see behind these citizen initiatives always are great thinkers that are transforming and changing the idea of how you live, how you practice the city. We take the ideas of Rancière and how these citizen initiatives are decent forms in the city, so we can learn many things about that, and are not the architects always who are doing these things, but we as an architect, I think we can transform and transfer this different knowledge that came from theory practice to our real practice as a project, as a practices architect.
Okay, so learning from, that's a program. I'm told that we have to close up for time reasons. Thank you very much, and we are now going to the amphitheater to hear Reinhold Martin, who I think will be giving us more insights on that. Thank you.